for the webinar. I'll now turn it over to Chris Lawton, Director of Knowledge Exchange here at Farm Credit East, who will be introducing our presenter today.
Hello, thank you, Kyle. So our presenter today, Dr. Charlie Hall, really needs no introduction for those of you in the horticultural world, but we'll do one anyway. Mr. Hall or Dr. Hall, I should say, is a native of North Carolina, where he received a bachelor's degree in agricultural economics from the University of Tennessee, a master's in ornamental horticulture and landscape design also from the University of Tennessee, and he received his PhD from Mississippi State University. He is now a professor in the Ellison Chair in International Floriculture at Texas A&M University. Dr. Hall is nationally recognized as the leading agricultural economist for the green industry in the United States. Dr. Hall currently serves as chief economist for American Hort, the Trade Association of American Nursery and Flower Growers, and he's president of America in Bloom. I could go on and on about his accolades and various appointments, but I'll leave it at that and let him get started. So, and before we begin, I just have to mention our obligatory disclaimer here that neither us nor Dr. Hall are giving investment, tax, or legal advice in today's webinar. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Hall. Take it away.
All right, thanks very much, Chris. I appreciate that introduction. Let me show my screen here and we'll get started. All right, here we go. Now we're going to talk a little bit about 2020, and then I'm going to talk about 2021, obviously, and give us a little bit of insight on what I feel is going to happen throughout the rest of the year. Of course, last year when I was doing this particular program, I had my vision for 2020 all mapped out, ready to go, and we were going to do really well. And then, of course, COVID hit, and that disrupted things temporarily. But by and large, for the green industry, COVID ended up being not necessarily a good thing, but I mean, it could have been a lot worse. But a number of folks in the industry, whether they were growers, service providers, or retailers, found that their year-over-year sales were actually increased. And in fact, I have a peer group, which is called the EAGLE Group, Executive Academy for Growth and Leadership. Excuse me. And it's like an executive MBA program for nursery and greenhouse growers. And I was meeting with this group monthly from basically June on during 2020. And at the end of the year, I did kind of a recap survey during one of our web sessions. And I asked them, all right, relative to 2020, this is December, right? Where this is the time frame we're talking about. And at the time, COVID cases were spiking again. So I asked them what percent of normal capacity were they running at? Well, 2/3 of them were blowing and going. And these are growers, 2/3 of them blowing and going at 100% capacity. And then roughly the other third were either at 80 to 99% or in that 60 to 79%. And a lot of it depended on what part of the country they were in and which segments they were selling into, which retail venues, which landscapers, and so forth, or whether they sold into the green infrastructure market. And there in the Farm Credit East market, you've got a number of growers who specialize in the green infrastructure market. And there were a number of projects that were shovel ready pre-COVID that were shelved during the course the COVID outbreak and are still yet to be broken ground on. So there's some pent-up demand in the green infrastructure market, but right now, those growers selling into it, they're struggling a little bit. So I asked growers about their gross sales as well, and you can see it ranged across the board in terms of their year-to-date sales compared to 2019. There were some that were up by more than 25%. There were some, up 21 to 25, and I won't go through all these, but you see a chunk of growers right here that were up 11 to 15%. So, and then there were some that were kind of status quo, and they were up only just slightly, or they were down. You can see over here on the right-hand side of this bar chart, there were some growers that their sales were not in 2020 what they were in 2019. Now, top line sales is one thing, but when you look down to bottom line, you see a little bit more of a bell-shaped curve here in the data, anywhere from 0 up to 25%. You even had a few growers that their net profits were up more than 25%. Now this data again is across my Eagle firms. There's roughly over 100 of those firms that have gone through my executive MBA program for growers, but I think there were 44 that answered this particular survey. So out of that group, that's kind of we don't have any other data. So in lack of other data, this is kind of a proxy for how 2020 went. And I also asked them about their pre-booked sales as kind of an indicator is that many retailers had difficulty sourcing product in whenever they were deemed to be essential. And that was one thing that really chapped my hide a little bit, is that there were certain areas of the country where our industry was not necessarily deemed to be essential. And anybody knows that from my writing before about the economic, the environmental health and well-being benefits of flower, shrubs, and trees and improved landscapes, we know that they're essential to the quality of people's lives. And so there were a bunch of governors around the country that didn't know that fact. So we've got some education we've got to do with those folks. But due to the fact that retailers had some difficulty in sourcing product, getting enough of it, I asked, well, what about your pre-booked sales? And when I asked them, how many of you are far ahead of spring 2020? And roughly just shy of a quarter of them. And then about a third were a bit ahead. So 42% roughly were up, but not dramatically, from 0 to 9%. And then there were just a few that were down. But I included this picture on here because it's young plants, and basically every young plant grower across the country that I've talked with, now I talked with a lot of them, they indicated that young plant sales were really strong. And that is, in fact, one of the best years they've had in recent years. Now that tells me a little something there, that, these young plant sales are strong. Those young plants get transformed magically into finished plants. And so I was looking for 2021, there may be some surplus situations that were happening. So a lot of it depends on the ultimate consumer, right? And whether or not they come to the table the same way they did in 2020. Now, again, once we got past the essentiality question, and garden centers were open, landscapers were open, growers were open, there was this pent-up demand from people staying at home. They were working from home. They're recognizing, hey, I need to spruce up my landscape. I'm looking out my office window here as I speak, and I see a lot of plants, right? I've enhanced my landscape. A lot of people were looking out there and saying, man, if I got to look at this every day, I better spruce it up. So there the strong sales in April and May. Many growers had some of the best 2 months there stretch that they'd had in recent years. So again, there's a lot of moving parts here. I mentioned retailers. So this is data that I get from my friend Danny Summers, the Garden Center Group. It's another peer group of retailers. Some of you listening may actually be a part of the Garden Center Group. But you can see it differs by region in terms of how their sales were compared to 2019. And it ranged from 23 to 37%. And you see much of the Farm Credit East territory there, again, sales were up. They weren't as high as the upper Midwest and of course the Southwest and South. But you got for the lower realm of your Farm Credit East market, that was up by about a third, and then about a quarter for the rest of it. So very mixed results, but still they were up year over year. That was a good thing. Transaction counts were up, and many garden centers were saying, we've seen faces in here we've never seen before. And by some anecdotal estimates, there were some that saying, well, we've got about 9 million more new customers in the garden and landscaping trade that we've not seen before. And these are newbies. Now, that's good, but historically, when I've been at this game 32 years in academia, and I grew up in the nursery business, as you heard Chris say earlier, and so I've seen this situation before where we have this recessionary contraction, people staying at home more, spending less on Disney and traveling and so forth. And we see that shot in the arm with our industry. And yet when the recovery starts, that's generally when we see our industry take it on the chin, because people will have that pent up demand for durable goods. So when the recovery starts, they buy fewer annuals and shrubs and trees and so forth, and they start buying more cars, refrigerators, furniture, and then that shifting in expenditures is what that's when we see our industry sales dip relative to, and that's happened in every single recession right up to the Great Recession. I mean, that one was so deep and long and so forth, we didn't see that effect. But in all previous recessions, we had a shot in the arm, and then we took it on the chin when people made the switch to durable goods. Now, 2021, well, here we are. We're getting more people vaccinated. We got more vaccines. We're about hopefully around to turning the corner on COVID. Is spring 2021 going to be the same as spring 2020? That's the magic question. And as I think through that, the thing that I'm reminded of is that switch to durable goods. But third and fourth quarter data in 2020, we saw more durable goods purchases than we had previously. It's still the services purchases that are down, and all but landscape services. I'll get to that in a second. So if the people are started making those durable goods purchases, then and they're still staying at home during spring, we might very well see the continued growth in the lawn and garden retail sales as we saw here. Again, it's a big uncertain, big question mark. Landscape sales, again, depending on what part of the country, there were some landscape service sales that were up significantly. You can see this chart here. There were about 43% that were either status quo or slightly down. But the rest of these folks over here, strong landscape sales. And again, a lot of it depended on where they were. All right, let's switch to 2020. 2021. I can't talk about it though unless I hit COVID first, because I've said this in every single talk I've given for a year now. The shape of the economic recovery is correlated with the shape of the COVID curve. And fortunately, if you look at the COVID curves, we're seeing improvement, right? So that inverse correlation, we should start seeing the economy propel forward with pent-up demand and the relief packages that are part of the $900 billion that was passed back in December by Congress, and then the $1.9 billion that the House just passed the night before last. We'll see how that plays out. But the COVID curves, if you look at tests, cases, hospitalizations, deaths, any of the stats, we're seeing the favorable trend, right? We're, in terms of cases, we're back to where we were basically last summer when we had that first spike after the lull in the early spring. We had that first spike. We're basically at that point right now. We've got to get to herd immunity, and to do that, we got to get to the vaccines. And so there's a graphic by Statistica. I always like, they have some interesting things to show the number of vaccines that are being widely used in the world. There's a number of them, and of course Pfizer and Moderna are the big ones here in the U.S. And then Johnson & Johnson just released a third big one, only one dose required. Hey, I got my first vaccine yesterday afternoon. I got the first Moderna vaccine. Few weeks will pass and I'll get number 2, and then I'm good. I'm in good shape. But we need a lot of other people. Dr. Fauci has said we need about 64% of folks to be vaccinated in order to achieve herd immunity, and that's going to be a challenge because immunization has been politicized just like masking was. And some of the growers, even some there in the Northeast, in the Farm Credit East territory, some of them may be online. Whenever they were surveying their employees, all the H-2A workers, no problem, we'll get vaccinated. What do you just tell me when, and I'm there. But when they surveyed their domestic workforce, 50 to 55% of them said that they were willing to get vaccinated. So this is going to be a challenge. However, if we reach herd immunity, it's likely to be around first or third quarter or the fourth quarter This is a McKinsey graphic, and I thought it illustrated that principle fairly well. So the most likely scenario is herd immunity in Q3 or Q4 this year. And that's if we have more than one vaccine, check that box. And if the vaccine is distributed to a sufficient portion of the population, it's about 6 months. Well, the Biden administration's already talked about their plans for getting ramping up the number of doses and so forth. So that's a hopefully a checkbox there. But then you got that third one, that there's broad-based willingness to be vaccinated. I'm not sure we can check that box. So I'm a bit concerned. So obviously the fact that I've been I got my first vaccination yesterday, you know my mindset. If you got it out there, go ahead and go for it. Of course, I used to take flu shots too. So science is science. Data, don't lie. Now let's talk about the economy. Real GDP. You can see the graphics here. And by the way, I am keeping tabs on the questions box and the chat box. If you want to put something in there, I'll try to answer any questions you got as we go. But as you can already tell, I'm pumped up, fired up. I'm ready. I've been ready to do this all morning. So I'm going 90 miles an hour here, which tells me I'm going to provide these slides to Chris. And if there's any of you that want to get these slides, you can get it from him, or you can email me directly. Either way. Just send me an email, c-hall@tamu.edu. I'll send you the PowerPoint slides. Right? They're going to be outdated in 2 weeks anyway, because I update them continuously with the new numbers. So anyway, second quarter last year, that's where we saw that 31.4% decrease. And then the third quarter, we bounced back with a 33.4% increase. That didn't mean that GDP decreased by a third and then increased by a third. That's seasonally adjusted annualized numbers. That means, what does that mean, Charlie? When I hear that in the news, that GDP declined 31.4% second quarter, seasonally adjusted annualized number, that means that if the next 3 quarters we had the same exact economic performance, for the year it would be 31.4% down. Right? In the same way with the 33.4% increase. If the next 3 quarters we had the same exact performance, then for the annualized estimate, we'd see 33.4. So if you look at quarter over quarter, though, there was a 9% decrease in GDP, and then a 7.4% increase in GDP in third quarter. And then we saw in fourth quarter, the second estimate just came out, 4.01% in the fourth quarter. But we're still down from where, even with this increase in the third and fourth quarter, we're still down from where we were in Q4 2019, right? So we made our way back, but not all the way back. All right, now, and then our next couple of slides or graphs here, unemployment insurance. And you can see the 4-week moving average is still around 800,000. We economists generally agree that anything over 400,000 is not a good thing for the labor market. And you can see that the insert chart that I included here, the initial claims for unemployment, a lot of that was for the brown part of this bar right here that I got my cursor around. That's the initial claim for the pandemic unemployment assistance. And then of course, we also had some pandemic emergency compensation funds that people were applying for. So once they move from initial claims, they go over here to the right to continuing claims. You can see that the regular state unemployment declining, as well as the folks that are on the pandemic unemployment assistance and the PEUC assistance. But that's going down, but we still have a lot of folks that are being bolstered with unemployment funds. Now, anecdotally, there are those in the industry say, well, we need these programs to stop because we're finding it hard to find workers because their wage rates are higher when they're supplemented with unemployment. We can't pay them enough to draw them back to work or to hire them here at our place. And I've heard that anecdotally all across the country. But there's a study conducted by Yale that looked at that very issue, and they just said it's not in the data. We don't see it. But anecdotally, I mean, I've talked to a lot of folks and they said we can't get All right, so that my follow-up question is always, what's your wage rate? Because there's been this push for $15 an hour minimum wage, and a lot of folks saying that's going to kill me if I have $15 minimum wage. But the last farm labor survey shows that it just came out because they had the new H-2A rates were just set last week. So last week, yeah, roughly. And so the last farm labor survey shows that across livestock and crop enterprises, farm labor, I think it was 1562 or maybe in 1542. My point is, it was already over $15. So again, if you may be paying $15 or less than 15 in Bakersfield, but you're certainly not in the Salinas Valley, not getting, and I'm using a non-Northeast example there, but you're not you're certainly not going to get away with that in the Salinas Valley. So anyway, that issue about minimum wage, we're not, just because it's not going to be incorporated into the 1.9 trillion relief package that Congress is now considering, doesn't mean that we're done with it. We'll have those discussions. FYI, if you were to take the highest point at which the federal minimum wage has and put it in today's dollars, using the CPI or the personal consumption expenditures deflator, whatever tool you want to use, it would range. If we take the current one and inflate it, it's $9 an hour. If we take the highest that the minimum wage has ever been in real dollars and put it to today's dollars, it would be $12. So likely, if you just look at the data, we'll probably see somewhere between $9 and $12. But I don't want to get off on that too much because that's not the point of the day. Let me move on. All right, I'm taking my time. Good to go. Recessions nearly ended for high wage workers, but not so for low wage workers. You can see that everybody making more than 60K, the employment's back. They've even gained in terms of their jobs, but not so for the low wage and for the middle wage folks. So this thing is not impacted, COVID has not impacted everybody equally. And fortunately for our customers, they are in this category of high wage unemployment. Most lawn and garden consumers are making more than $60,000 a year. Now I'm going to mute myself so I can clear my throat real quick. Okay, now I'm back. Now that high wage the employee there, that one making over $60,000 a year, and that's not all that high, but all of our lawn and garden consumers that are in our key, our main consumer group are in that wage category. So again, that's good news in terms of potential retail sales. There is more assistance coming down the pike. This is the December relief package past $900 billion. There's some more PPP funds that are in there. USDA is still considering, right? I just had a conversation with a couple of folks from USDA yesterday. They're still considering on what the package is going to be offered, if any, and they wanted to know about the situation within the green industry and how they were going to position nursery and greenhouse growers in those relief funds. So stay tuned on that one. I don't have any news to report. Retail sales. Obviously, again, the COVID was not equal across retail sectors, restaurants, gas merchants, clothing retailers, and so forth. A lot of those folks took it on the chin. And but if you look at where most of our lawn and garden consumption is coming, if you break down the pie for where people spend money on the lawn and garden and landscaping activity, it's over here in recreation services, and then on the right, recreation goods, right? And some of the Yelp data, Charlie, you really quoting me Yelp data? Well, I am, because this is this data is fast moving, and Yelp mines their data religiously, and they must have some really good economists mining that Yelp data. And if you look here on the left-hand side, all these red arrows reflect industries that are related to the green industry and where there's the largest percent increase in consumer interest in those categories. So that's good. You know, people are interested. Let me switch to housing, because again, housing is strongly correlated with the green industry sales. Why is housing doing so well? Well, I've got basically the answer in these 3 bullets, and these bullets correspond to these 3 graphs, that high wage workers are driving the housing demand, and of course, affordability is at an all-time high. Well, let me talk about high wage workers, what I mean there. The higher wage workers, since they didn't lose their job and are staying at home, many of them, white collar, so forth, and if I'm going to be working at home, heck, I might as well be working at a second home at the beach, or I need more space. I need more office space. So some housing demands coming in from those high wage workers, but also millennials. This panel up here at the upper right or upper left, millennials. It's the millennial wave is coming, and you got the oldest millennials are 40 to 41 years of age right now, and they're in their home buying and building years, just starting that. So that wave is going to be hitting us over the next decade. And so I'm very bullish on that particular segment, but that we need to stay relevant to them. And millennials, I've been teaching those folks for 20 years now, and they are very concerned about their environmental consciousness, but also health and well-being. Those are 2 benefits that we provide with improved landscapes that we need to continue emphasizing to millennials to remain relevant to them. Lastly, as any Farm Credit East customer knows, mortgage rates are down. Affordability is really pretty good right now, so that's good. Because of supply and demand, though, we have on the right-hand side here, right-hand side, we only have about 1.9 months worth of houses in the pipeline right now. Now think about that. Only less than a couple. We normally have 5 to 6 months, and most of the housing pundits, they feel really good when we have about 6 months worth of supply. We only have 2 months worth of supply, less than that. So the demand pressures are there. The supply is limited. What gives? Price. And you see that in the Case-Shiller Home Price Index, whether you look at the national index or the top 20 cities or the top 10, all of those indices are up over where they were prior to the Great Recession. Now remember, the Great Recession was caused by a housing bubble burst in the midst of a financial crisis. We had both of them occur at the same time. And again, all your Farm Credit East folks will tell you that the financial sector is in a whole lot better shape today than it was prior to the Great Recession. So even though prices are higher than what they were prior to the Great Recession, and we will see a housing price correction. When? Well, that's a good question. You know, I thought it was going to be during COVID, but not so. So you got the affordability, you've got the demand there. So prices are increasing. They're 46% higher than even what they were back before the Great Recession. So, but the big difference, and why a housing correction won't make as much a difference in the overall economy as it did back then, is the financial sector. Financial risk is really low. You look at the St. Louis Financial Risk Index, and it's just ridiculously low. So that's good. And you see that the housing starts are increasing, and you can see the forecast on the right-hand side, that's increasing as well. Again, whenever there's a new house built, people got to put flowers, shrubs, trees, turf, and so forth around those houses. So that's built-in demand right there. Now, services. This has been a services recession. Unlike previous recessions where goods took it on the chin, this time services, particularly those that offer face-to-face services. All those businesses on the right, I'm not going to read them all off. You can see them there, right there. But they're in the red. Those are businesses that are face-to-face interaction. Obviously, COVID would make a difference there. On the left-hand side, we got tree services and landscaping. They're in the green. Not so much, right? It's not so much of an influence. So that's been really good for our industry. Now, let me talk about the output gap, where we could be had COVID not reared its ugly head. That's one of the things I want to emphasize. On the left here, I've got real GDP that's seasonally adjusted. Again, real means it's already been adjusted for inflation. So you got when George W. left office, we were in the midst of the Great Recession. Obama took the first term, then they got Obama's second term, and then Trump's term right here, and then the pandemic, the fall off in GDP. Now, interestingly, right, I hear a lot of folks talking about how better it was for the green industry during the Trump years and so forth. And they're probably remembering the Tax Cut and Jobs Act and the deregulatory environment. Folks tend to remember those things favorably. But if you look at the national economy, there's no Trump bump, so forth. I could fit a regression line through there very nicely. And so that's why we see that 2.5% growth rate as being the new normal for the economy. And anytime you have 3 or above, that's the abnormal. Those are other circumstances that are kicking into play. And you think about it, $22 trillion economy, 2% growth. I'd rather have 2% on 22 trillion than 4% of 8 trillion, which is, that's the time period we were much smaller economy when we're having those kind of growth rates. Now, this output gap over here on the right, again, this is the forecast of where we would have been had the pandemic not kicked in, and we're still not back to where we were. And I drew this in my own graph, and you see that right here. 6 months ago, I developed this graph, and it's been playing out. I'm not a forecaster, and I admit that right up front, but I actually did a pretty good job in forecasting that the decrease, the initial bounce back, fourth quarter, and then the recovery from here. Again, it's dependent on whether we get this health crisis under control, the level of pent-up demand, again, whether that demand for services kicks back in and durable goods purchases kicks back in. Hang on one second. I gotta clear my throat again. All right, I'm back. Now, and the number of business failures and the policies that are put in place. And again, we have the policies right now that we're debating which ones are needed. Some are saying we don't need any, but that's really ignoring the low inflation we've had over the last decade, in spite of the injections into our M2 money supply. So really, we've averaged 1.6% inflation over the last decade, and most of the forecasters are looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.8 to 2.2 over this year. And the Federal Reserve's already said that we're willing to let it go over our 2% trigger for a while. In fact, the VP of the Fed said that we want to see a year at 2% before we start raising interest rates. So that'll provide some solidity in terms of some strategic decisions. When we look at the leading economic index, which is a combination of 10 different indicators rolled into one, and those of you who heard me speak before know that I generally include this particular index in my talks because it is a leading index. It's a foretelling of the economy 11 and 12 months down the road. And you can see that this panel insert right here, the last 12 months have the dip and then the subsequent increase. And just for kicks, I overlaid my previous graph, the one I developed myself. I overlaid that down here on the right. And again, I'm not a forecaster, but dadgum, that's a pretty nice fit right there. But again, the direction of our recovery from here is contingent on those things that I talked about. And we got to get that right for faster growth to occur. Now, if we do get it right, then this particular chart from Vanguard showed downside risk, their base case, 60% likelihood, and then the upside surprise, 30% likelihood. And they said in their base case, most economies will achieve infection immunity, that herd immunity, by the end of 2021. That social and business activity normalizes by the second half of 2021, and that the unemployment rate continues, and that the inflation continues moving toward target, but not too much over target, and that we reached we closed the output gap that I just showed you by the end of this year. If that occurs, we should see 4% growth in GDP this year, real GDP. That would be the best growth we've had since the Great Recession, even before then. Now, upside surprise, right, is 30% likelihood is it could be 6%. There are some pundits right now calling for, they'll say that GDP is likely to increase 6%. That would be unprecedented, right? But that would be the result of all this pent up demand and putting the right policy measures in place. And most of the forecasts for 2022 are ranging in that 3 to 3.5% range for the base case. That's my own terminology in terms of, I separated that out. If the aggressive forecasters are looking at perhaps 5% in 22, if we get things right. Okay. Now that's ceteris paribus, holding all other things constant. We economists love that assumption. It takes a lot of heat off of us. What does a post-COVID-19 green industry look like? Well, it's my contention we're likely to see this undersupply of houses and this pent-up demand on housing last for a while. Even if we have a correction, it's not going to be as deep as what it was during the Great Recession. So I think that's a good thing. People need flowers, shrubs, and trees around those houses. There is going to be continued strain on the energy sector. Good gracious. We saw a big strain here in Texas 2 weeks ago, a strain on the energy sector. And heck, we're the energy state. We might as well be codenamed the Lone Star State and the energy state. But you see, you got to have the right policies in place to make sure that you winterize when you're supposed to. And who thought that Texas would freeze over, right? Anyway, there's going to be constraints on that energy sector. Again, OPEC and Russia are unknowns in this. Saudi Arabia is usually the buffer there in the worldwide petroleum prices, and they're saying we're done with that, but we'll see how it all plays out. Fortunately, diesel prices aren't likely to increase that much in 2021. All right, so you can go to the energyinformationagency.gov, and that's where you can see their short-term energy forecast. My own index of prices paid by growers is going to be released in the coming weeks, and I'll do a video series for American Hort, and so you'll see that those projections as well in there. I've got a whole appendix on the energy sector. Business closures, obviously, we don't know exactly how many businesses are going to end up permanently shuttered, but it's going to be higher than normal. The counter to that, let me back up there. The counter to that is that we're seeing an unprecedented rate of new business formation right now. People, again, necessity is the mother of invention, and people are thinking outside the box in terms of what business can be generated. You got sanitation for services, for example. The university, we can only clean classrooms every so often, and we would do it. We got to do it then. We can't spend a whole day cleaning a classroom. So we've hired professional services come in to do that within an hour or so, and it's kept our university going. So there's all kinds of innovative ideas and new businesses. The supply chain constraints that we saw during COVID, I think, are going to be sorted out, but those will still be constrained until we get enough business-to-business technology incorporated in our supply chain that we have better linkages between all the different sectors: allied trade, growers, landscape, consumer, direct-to-consumer. Till we get a lot of those things automated through technology, we may still see some of those supply chain constraints if we have disruptions like we saw during COVID. But for growers, it still comes down to shrink, labor, and working capital. That's the trifecta. If you can manage your shrink, you can control your labor expenses, which are more expensive today, by the way. I'll get to that in a second. But then you can manage your working capital so that you're not over leveraged, but you have enough cash flow in which to not only invest in tradable assets, your inventory, and so forth, to make sure that you're not that you have enough working capital to go through a spring if there was an intervention. There's going to be higher operating costs from worker and customer safety requirements. Just because COVID is going on the downtrend, that doesn't mean that we continue or we can just forget about keeping workers and customers safe. The interesting thing is that many growers in my Eagle program, they talked about the SOPs that they put in place to combat COVID, to work in the midst of COVID, and some of them found that they were actually more efficient by social distancing and spreading people out, like on the propagation line. There's several growers found, wow, we've seen improvements in our productivity, and we're not going to go back to the old SOPs. That's kind of interesting there. Lastly, rising input costs. And I do have my table here from my index of prices paid by growers. These are a bunch of numbers. Just know two things. Down on the left-hand side, I've got all the inputs that growers are using: containers, media, propagative materials. 2007, right before the Great Recession, is my base year. So 2007 equals 100. So anytime you have an index over here, like for containers, 117.8 for 2020, that means last year containers were 17% more expensive than they were in 2007. And you can see the respective weightings that I have here as a percent of their production expenses. And then I take the weight times the index, and I calculate an overall year-over-year increase in inputs. So COVID slowed down the inflationary pressures on our inputs for the industry. I have only, in my index, I calculated only a less than 1% increase year over year, this 0.54, where I'm circling my cursor right there, where the yellow, the bottom of the yellow column, the 0.54% year over year. And but then I developed a forecast for the first year, and this forecast is for 2021 forecast. And each one of these industries, like containers and other plastics, I went through market research reports. I called allied trade manufacturers, distributors, collected all this information, developed my model, and have a forecast. So the forecast for 2021 is that all these inputs are going to increase. When you weight them all, the average increase across all of our inputs at the grower level is going to increase 5.24%. 5.24%. Now, plastics, I've got roughly an 9% increase built in there. Now, I make the caveat in my report that I'm already hearing anecdotes of plastic sheeting for greenhouses ranging from 20 to 40% price increases. And I think part of that's some posturing on the part of some of these allied trade firms, but it could be even higher. But when you take these indices and multiply them times the weight, that's where I get that weighted average estimate of 5.24. Labor, though, it's already almost 51% more expensive than it was prior to the recession. That's how you read that index right there, 150. Labor's 51%. And of course, we just found out that the new H2A wage rates, and those growers in the upper Northeast that are paying H2A labor, it's going to be more expensive. It's still tied to the Farm Labor Survey. There was a movement at the end of last year to tie the H2A rates back to the employment cost index, which only increases about 2.25%, maybe 2.5% each year, but at least that was going to be a stable increase that growers could count on. And now with the Farm Labor Survey, that ranges, generally 2 to 6% increase. And so there's less dependable forecasting that you can do on that. But it is what it is, and the courts ruled. So we'll see whether that still gets changed in the future. Whew-wee. So with that, I want to stop there in terms of my sharing, and I want to turn my attention to asking questions. I've gone 44 minutes. My goal was to go 37 minutes, and I tried to talk fast enough to get that done in 37 minutes, but we still got some time for Q&A. So lay it on me. Let's see if there's any questions.
Okay, Dr. Hall, just to remind everyone, if you have questions, please go to the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. You can access that by clicking on the red arrow in the upper right-hand corner of your screen and just type in the questions that you have, and we will ask them of Dr. Hall. To address one of the first questions that came in that's pretty basic information is about getting a copy of your slides and the recording. Those will both be posted to www.farmcreditease/webinars after the webinar, and it'll be posted by probably by the end of the day today, or certainly by tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah,
way the recording and the slides will be available to those who would like to review it or those who could not attend live.
Yeah, because as soon as we get off, Chris, I will send you my a Dropbox link to the slides, and that way you can throw that up there. Because I'm updating these things. I was updating numbers this morning, right? The latest data that comes in.
Sure, we appreciate that. It's always very timely to have you give us a presentation. So a couple of questions that came in. One is the economic recovery, as you mentioned, probably will have a lot to do with the trajectory of the COVID virus. And I know your crystal ball may not be any better than anyone else's, but do you have a most likely scenario that you think of what might happen there and what we might see later this year? Probably, I think COVID's going to be with us certainly until probably May, June, but what are you seeing after that?
Yeah, the most optimistic forecast in terms of vaccination and developing herd immunity is by the end of April. I mean, I saw that, I almost couldn't believe my eyes. But that was I forget who put that particular forecast out, but that's the earliest. And again, I showed the one slide earlier, which showed potential herd immunity being achieved by the third quarter, which would basically, be late summer on into the fall. I think late summer is an achievable goal, and if we get to herd immunity before then, I think we'll be well. That's aspirational, but we can hope for the best. The Biden administration has instituted a plan on increasing the number of doses that are distributed. There's always a hurdle to overcome, and the pinch point has been at the state level in terms of different states handle the distribution of those vaccine doses differently, and they have a different prioritization process as well in terms of who gets it first and so forth. So I only got my vaccine yesterday. It wasn't because of my age, but it's because my cardiovascular history, right? The quadruple bypass 5.5 years ago. So I got bumped up. And so I think with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that we'll start seeing a more rapid roll up. And so March, we should see a marked improvement. But to get the 64% immunization to achieve that herd immunity, to me, it's aggressive to think end of April. But the good news is that we're talking about this year, not 2022. So yeah. So but you know what? In terms of the retail sales, garden centers responded accordingly last year. They put into place SOPs to ensure that they could either sell lawn and garden plant materials at a distance, make sure that they're maintaining safety in their stores, and or curbside pickup. So garden centers were really responsive. So I don't think that COVID is necessarily going to be a barrier to lawn and garden sales. It's going to be the demand from the consumer that's the big if. So I think we've got that figured out, how we can compete and do it effectively. But is the consumer going to respond? To me, that's the big question.
Yeah. So we have a couple interesting questions have come in. One is about genetic engineering. It's been with us for a while on like major ag row crops, things like corn and soybeans and whatnot. But we're starting to see some ornamental plants genetically engineered with some new colors or new varietal traits that weren't previously possible. What do you see about the effect of say, consumer acceptance on some of these genetically engineered plants compared to their traditionally bred counterparts?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. And I actually conducted a survey several years ago looking at ornamentals versus food products. Because when you think, some people, when they think of horticulture, they think fruits and veggies first. I don't know why odd people, weird people like that would do that. But I was comparing the fruit and veggie side of horticulture versus the ornamental side. And what I found is in terms of any sort of resistance to purchase is mostly on the food side, because those products that are genetically engineered are consumed and they're coming inside the body. By and large, with ornamental products, the plants that have been genetically modified, I did not see any of that resistance. People didn't mind if their kids were playing in grass that's genetically modified, or climbing trees, or whether their shrubs were genetically modified. So that there was it was just night and day in terms of that resistance on the part of the customer. Now, not only are we enhancing the aesthetics of plant materials, I think it's also important to know that we're using some of those same technologies to combat, things like boxwood blight. I'm on a national SCRI grant project right now looking at boxwood blight, and the boxwoods are all along the eastern seaboard, a very important skew in our mix. And so we need to make sure that we do things to enhance the likelihood that we're going to keep boxwoods around. So we're using some of those same technologies on rose rosette, boxwood blight, and a lot of the things that would hinder us from selling, or maybe cause fear in the marketplace from using those products. And so now, can you imagine a green industry without roses or boxwood? I mean, those are important items in our palette, plant palette. So we're able to protect those with those same technologies. So, but the main point that as the question was inferring and I answered, is that we don't see the resistance on the part of the consumer purchasing and their fear of anything that's been genetically modified on the ornamental side.
Okay. Question came in about sales per employee average, or sales per average employee in the industry. A few years back, the asker says the average sales per employee of the industry was around $140,000 per, gross sales per employee. Is that number still true, or is it higher now, do you think?
No, well, actually, that's the last operating cost study that was put out by HRI, the Horticulture Research Institute, was 1983. Now, I remember that. I don't know why I do, but I do. So it was 1983. The sales per FTE in that report for nurseries was around 80,000, right? So for nurseries, that ranges today from that same 80,000 all the way up to about 200,000. The exact numbers I don't remember off the top of my head, but that is data that I collect in my benchmarking program that I do for the industry. It's called Your Market Metrics. If anybody is interested, I collect income statement and balance sheet data and some operational metrics. On the greenhouse side, though, that same sales per FTE and profit per FTE is higher on the greenhouse side than it is the nursery side. It's in the upper 200,000s on the greenhouse side per FTE. At any point, though, if you say that $140,000 figure, that's pretty amazing. Every employee, there's an employee who walked by the window, that's $140,000. There's another $140,000 employee. That's a lot better than saying, oh, there's a $26,000 employee, right? So we've gained in our ability to have throughput through the nursery and greenhouse operations. It's a little higher on greenhouse, shorter term crops, more turns and so forth. But if you're at 140,000 sales per FTE, full-time equivalent, which you can basically take the number of labor hours divided by 2,080 or 2,040, if you give a 2-week vacation or whatever, and come up with your FTEs. If you've got in 140,000, you're doing pretty good, right? You're in and around the median and the mean. Both the median and the mean are right around 140,000 for the nursery side of the green industry.
Okay. Now, one of the things that you mentioned in your presentation today was the significant increase in labor costs, or the labor cost index, as you put it, for the industry. I guess how threatening do you see that to be for the industry, or how do you think the industry is going to be able to cope with things if labor costs continue to increase at this, outpacing inflation rate?
Yeah, and obviously we will see that slow down over time, because it is cyclical like other elements of the economy. So we won't continue to see those 5 or 6% increases in that. But still, over the last 12 years, for it to be half again as more expensive as what it was in 2007, I mean, that's a higher inflation rate on green industry wages than it is on wages in general. But, and I'd say that same thing holds true for agriculture. And of course, those H-2A wages tend to be a base for a lot of our domestic wages as well. Whatever that H-2A adverse effect wage rate is, then that tends to be a base. But as I mentioned earlier, that average wage across all of agriculture is still over $15. The key is, what do we do about it? Well, automation and mechanization is one of those tools, but many would contend that they have been automating and mechanizing for years, and that we've probably gained as much of that as we can. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I hear a lot. So secondly, obviously you can implement lean flow analyses within your operation. And if there's a participant that's listening that's not done a lean flow analysis, here you have an opportunity to increase efficiencies to the tune that's ranged from basically status quo up to 35% labor savings. Right, I've seen that range in terms of people that do a lean flow analysis on their event. So you can talk to Gary Cortez at golly, bum, I just drew a blank on lean flow. Anyway, that just search on lean flow, Gary Cortez or green industry lean flow, and you come up with what I'm not remembering right now off the top of my head. At any extent, you can do a lean flow analysis, right? Look at ways in which you're doing your labor intensive activities, minimizing the extra movements that workers are making, shortening distances between where they got to walk to, because you can pick up a 1 gallon, 4 1 gallon containers, and in each hand carry it 100 feet, and you've already cost yourself 12 cents in labor costs. So those things add up. So not only can you do a lean flow analysis, but then you could really dive into your SOPs, how you are doing different activities. And if you don't know what SOPs are, then you need to talk to me, and we need to get you in the Eagle program where you can hone those SOPs, because those are the ways in which you're doing things. Well, the key to reduce labor costs in the nursery and greenhouse business is to reduce touches. Anytime you can reduce a touch in your value chain, you're going to save labor costs. And so that's part of what lean flow is all about, is minimizing touches. But then I always tell growers, get your upper level management team to work very intensively with your supervisory crews and come up with ideas on how we can eliminate a touch, because every touch represents minutes that are saved. Those minutes add up to hours. Those hours add up to days, adds up to weeks, but it adds up to FTEs. And just last year, one firm, anecdotally, that I was working with through this process, they saved enough FTE that they say, I think it was 4 permanent employees that they were able to eliminate in terms of the hours that they represented. They didn't really cut, but they saved that many minutes. So then they were able to be doing more productive tasks when they saved those minutes. That's a long-winded answer, but I think I circled through all those options in terms of automation, mechanization, lean flow, looking at SOPs, eliminating touches. To me, that's the response in terms of labor. And the labor scarcity problem, I've seen in certain areas of the country, it's not really a labor scarcity problem, it's a wage issue. The growers don't like to hear that all the time, but it has in certain areas of the country. And in the Northeast, not so much, right? Your wage levels are higher than they are in certain other areas of the country. Whew, that's a long-winded answer to that question, but I think I got it.
No, that was some good insight. Question about, we talked about how sales and profits were up for many green industry producers in 2020. that was obviously a combination of both increased sales and increased price per unit
Yes.
of the product sold. But do you have any insight as to which was more important of the two? Was it that growers got more volume, or that they were able to hold the line on pricing more, or increase prices? And which would you focus on more if you were a grower?
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is no. I don't have I don't know the exact percentage that the influence was either from increased units sold or whether it was the price increase. But I know both occurred, that there were both unit sales increases and that there were price increases, because I've been preaching for several years since I've collected this index of prices paid information that our input costs have been rising. And if we hold our prices static, then the only thing being squeezed out of that is profit margin. So I think growers have been hearing that, and so they've been adjusting their prices. And I just forecast another 5.24% increase in input costs for next year, for this year, right? So it's not too late then to go in and start thinking about pricing adjustments and how you're going to recuperate that 5.24% increase. Because if you do nothing, if you simply say, Charlie, my customers won't handle it, they won't take it, they'll get too much pushback. Well, how do you know, first of all? And then even if they do get pushback, this is a chance to illustrate your value proposition. See, every single business that's listening to me right now has a value proposition that's unique to their business. And it's not just the quality of their plants. I've heard that value proposition too often. And okay, yes, some growers grow better quality than others. You won't ever get folks to admit it, but that it is true. However, there are other elements of why people do business with you that's not necessarily quality oriented, or it's not price oriented. It's how easy it is to do business with you. It's the services that you're providing to them that are a part of that price package, that they're the value that they're getting from dealing with you versus somebody else. To me, when you're trying to implement price increases, you want to be thinking about your value proposition and how you're going to convey that to your customers to justify those price increases. You're just not throwing it on them, but you're saying, look, we've had input cost increases. However, these are some of the things that we're building into our value proposition for you that folks tell us that are the reason why they do business with it. So there's an analysis called a voice of the customer analysis that some growers have effectively utilized to get feedback from some of their customers. You hire a third-party entity to get some of that feedback, and then they use that in developing their value proposition so that they're always putting that message out there. This is what I stand for. This is what you get when you buy plants from me, right? And quality's a given, right? These services are what you're going to get in addition. It's easy to do business with me, and we've been in the business for 120 years. Whatever that is, here's the chance to emphasize that value proposition.
Great. So we're at the top of the hour, or a little bit over, and I want to respect everyone's time, including yours, Dr. Hall. So we'll wrap it up, but any final thoughts for us?
Well, I just want to say I appreciate the partnership that we've developed through the years, and both writing the Outlook and also the last couple of years doing this webinar. It's a chance to interact with your clientele. Again, it comes down to shrink, labor, and working capital. And if that's the trifecta, you can manage that shrink, make sure that your labor costs, you're implementing some of those strategies that I talked about earlier. And then, for goodness sake, make sure you're not over leveraged, because we don't know when the next downturn is going to happen. Make sure you got enough working capital in place, and there's a calculation for that. And that's part of my Your Market Metrics program that we always end up calculating a working capital for folks. And so, anyway, I appreciate the opportunity. If anybody's got any follow-up questions, they can email me. And as always, I appreciate being here.
Okay, and along those lines, Dr. Hall, if people have questions or want to follow up on like your Executive Academy or other programs that you have,
Yeah.
how can they do that?
The email c-hall
C-hall at
tamu.edu.
Okay, great.
Or they
Thanks a
can
lot.
Google Charlie Hall and Texas A&M. It's the search engine
Sure.
optimization. That's what it's all
Yep.
about.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I guess with that, we'll adjourn. And we really appreciate your presentation today, Dr. Hall.
You're welcome. Thank you.